Okay, let's get to it. Let's get to Frank Seravalli. All of our guests brought to you by the great folks at Zephyr Epic. Frank, we're going to start off with Heater here. What was your thoughts on the play with Alex Edler and Connor McDavid last night?
So I agree with you guys. I don't think it's worthy of any supplemental discipline at all. I could see maybe even stretching. I think it's a stretch to call it even a tripping penalty. I think the point was really well made by Chris, and I had spoken about that on my show earlier today. The idea of the back pressure from the forward there doesn't really leave a lot of room. And I understand the consternation, the anger, the angst from the Oilers fan base, because this is Connor McDavid. Like, this is maybe the best player of all time. And if you see him go out with a knee injury, it could derail his entire career. I get why you're upset. But in this case, the angle that did it for me, and I don't know if Alex still has it from my show earlier, but it's a reverse angle from TNT. And Alex Edler doesn't change his posture at all. He went in with a wide stance. He was gliding for about, 15 feet before he closes in on McDavid. And I think it's just an unfortunate and unlucky play. But given the history of Alex Edler and the knees, not just the Hyman one, but also going back to the world champs in 2013, he loses the benefit of the doubt. And so I get why it's a talking point. This is the angle. You can see Edler going in. Look, he doesn't move the leg at all. It doesn't change. And that, I think, to me,
way of hanging a knee too. I think it almost goes in. It's the opposite of hanging a knee almost.
You're right. It goes forward a little bit, but I don't think there's enough here to look at this and say this is something that should be suspended.
Yeah. No, I think we're all in the same books here. Are you happy? You get your Oilers Nation talking here? I know you like your Oilers talk.
I was like, case closed. Thanks for joining us, Frank.
All right, Frank.
Well, I talked about this on 7 different shows today, so I'm good today.
Yeah, I've already heard you on Vancouver radio this morning. So we'll dive into some Vancouver topics, obviously. I think there's got to be a lot of chatter going on right now. I'm curious just to get your thoughts on the overall trade market this early into the season without any. I mean, we've seen a few major injuries that are going to keep some players out and maybe affect cap, compliance down the road. It feels like a lot of those players that have suffered long-term injuries are expected to be back later on the season. So I'm curious, like, what do you think the trade market is over the next, 2 weeks kind of here? Like, are we going to see some sort of movement? Because there's a lot of people believing that the breaking point in Vancouver has already happened towards moving to trade. So what do you expect over the next 2 weeks, just league wide, really?
Yeah, Chris, I wouldn't be shocked at all to see something, it's percolating for sure. I think you could see something in the next couple weeks here before Christmas, without a doubt. There's enough teams that are unhappy with their starts in order to pursue conversations like this. I think that's a fact. And I'm not making any excuses or tamping down any sort of expectations or hunger for a trade. It's really hard to make one given the cap situations. And I wonder how much that really slows things down. There's also this performative dance that needs to happen with GMs that they can't, for whatever reason, a lot of times get down to brass tacks and do the deal. They need to, I like about 6 guys on your team. Okay. So who? And they go through this whole thing where it's like everyone knows kind of what you're after. And for whatever reason, they don't get down to business. It takes a while. It's like they're working him over between now and March 3rd. And in this case, I'm with you. Like, if there was going to be a coaching change, not to say that there ultimately won't be one in Vancouver, like, why didn't it happen last Tuesday after Jim Rutherford made his remarks on Monday? Like, it's gone on long enough. And I tend to believe that I think there's a trade coming, maybe even before a coaching change.
What did you make of those comments from Jim Rutherford? Like, what was your reaction to those? Is it fair? That type of thing?
Well, I think I don't even know if it's fair, because Bruce Boudreau he's done this for a long time. And he's been pretty good at his craft. He's won a lot. And he's handed a really imperfect roster and had a good run last year. And so I don't know that it was fair, but I do know that Jim Rutherford has a method to his madness. Like, he's also been around a long time and has won a lot. And what I was trying to figure out on the other end of it was, what is he trying to say here and who is he speaking to? It's not to the fan base, because I think everyone sees it vaguely the same way, or close close enough. Was he speaking to ownership? Was he saying, I want to make a coaching change, and I know you don't want to pay 3 coaches at the same time, but this might be best? Or was he? I can't come up with an explanation other than that, really, that makes any sort of sense. Other than that, in some ways, it also takes heat off of him for the lack of changes that were made this summer, particularly on the back end.
I think that's kind of, and you know what? It's, you know, this, Frank, it's a very engaged fan base here in Vancouver. And I think there's a lot of smart people here as well that were kind of saying what you're saying. Like, when you hear Jim Rutherford come out, who is he speaking that towards? Because I think you're right. I don't know if that was directed towards the fans. I was wondering, like we were talking about on the show the day after, like, is this a weird way to fire up the group? Because it feels strange, right? Like, we couldn't really put our finger on it. Like, that's the other thing too, when he talks about structure and talks about this roster, Canucks fans felt like after that Jim Rutherford media availability on Sportsnet that, like, okay, we've all heard this before now. We've heard all this. We've talked about the defense needing to be better. We've talked about the structure needing to improve. I don't think it's the structure from the coach. It feels like the structure of the team. That's kind of where the fan base got to from that. And it's weird because the way that Rutherford's talked about the future in the past, the fan base has been like, yeah, this all sounds great. But that one that he did last week, it really struck the fan base of like, okay, we've heard all this. We've heard all this. Do something. Do you think that like they could actually go much longer here without doing something major to this core?
No, and I think they're working on it. I think they've tried previously and never found something that they were ultimately comfortable with, and there's no doubt they're working on it now. I think whether it's very near term and short term or longer term, um, I just there's some smoke there. Like I think that they're beginning to have those conversations, whether it's about Bo Horvat, whether it's about trying to move out one of these larger contracts. Like part of the problem is that even among the guys that they'd really like to move, there's also no moves or no trades in place that really kind of handcuff them in some respects. So it's complicated. And where do you start picking off pieces? I think the rallying cry part of it was something that I also thought about. And I think Bruce Boudreau kind of seized on that a little bit the next day when you heard him talk and you were thinking like, okay, this is sort of the moment that that team might band together a little bit and rally around Bruce. Cause I do think in talking to a bunch of guys in that locker room at varying points this year, they really like him. And I think they've enjoyed playing for him. They don't think he's at fault, but they also have their own limitations, right? Like they can only be what they are. And in an odd way, it's made this so awkward for everyone because in some ways, watching and listening to Bruce Boudreau and reading between the lines from his comments after each and every game, it almost feels like he started to like distance himself from these players after a few games and losses where it was like, he started banging up the drum on the defense a little bit. And it was like, oh man, like I thought it might go one way and it's kind of gone the other, which has made it even more peculiar.
So the way we've had this conversation for the past, basically this week, especially big trade or Bruce Boudreau firing. What do you think happens first here? And big trade,
I
I'm
would
not
lean
talking
toward the
another
trade at this point.
Jackson. Yeah, I think I'm talking Horvat, Miller, Demko, something big like that before a trade or a firing. What do you think?
I would tend to agree with that based on how long this has dragged on. Jim Rutherford, the man speaking these comments, holds the keys. And I'm holding up an imaginary key ring. Like he's got all the keys right now that he could make that move, I think, if he wanted to. And has resisted for whatever reason. I don't know if that's an acknowledgement on his part that this is an imperfect team. Um, but the longer this has gone on, I tend to think trade and I tend to think Bo. I don't, who's taking on JT Miller with that term after that season that he may never touch 99 points or get close to it again. And as Thomas Drance has been beating this drum as well, is probably really a winger instead of a center. Like who's taking on that contract? I don't think anyone right now. Like they had the opportunity and missed it. And are you going to trade for 10 cents on the dollar or 20 cents on the dollar based on, the value that was out there previously for JT Miller? And like, how does that work? Like so you could then say Demko and you're like, okay, fantastic goalie in his prime that's been asked to do a ton and can clearly carry a team. And what would he look like under a team that's a lot better constructed? There's probably a ton of value there, but you better be damn sure in what you're building that, you don't end up needing him in 3 years, if that makes any
Yeah.
sense. And
No, it's
so I
true. I
think
mean,
there's
like,
danger in making that snap decision. But I just keep coming back to Bo, and I've always come back to Bo because I don't even know how much Bo wants to be here at this point. How much would you
yeah,
want
I
to
think
be
he wants
here
to
if
win.
the team has made it clear that you're not a priority, and the Band-Aid's getting ripped off at some point? You might as well just do it and enjoy your season.
Yeah. And you know what? Canucks fans would probably hope for the best, like really for him if he goes to a contender even for next year and is a rental and then hits free agency. Canucks fans would want that for Bo. I feel like, even though a lot of them want to see him stay here. But back to Miller, I find it interesting because yeah, there's a big contract starting next season. None of that no move, no trade stuff clicks in until next year, so he's still available. Patrick Alvin's confirmed that to us in the offseason. 10 goals and 6 assists through 17 games. Like, yes, there's a lot of questions about what he does defensively and if he's a center or not, but no team you don't think is sniffing around that to give up anything for Miller? Is he already a trade that needs to have something attached to it to get rid of him?
If he's not, he's close to it. Like I don't know who, like, because here's the problem, and I was talking to another GM about this today. Is if you could take on JT Miller in his entirety, then maybe that's one thing, and like you don't need to, you can swallow the whole cap hit if that makes any sense. But if you have to take from your team, which any sort of really good team or team knocking on the door of being a contender would, just to make the money, like it's not about giving something up. It's also the piece you have to pluck off of your team in order to fit him in. That changes the equation on everything.
Hmm. That's a really interesting perspective. You talked about how Bo Horvat's enjoying his season so far. We know he's not going to finish at a 68 goal pace. Well, we think he's not going to. He's on pace for it right now. We don't think he's going to finish with that.
Bo Gilney.
Bo Gilney. What does Bo Horvat get on the open market? I understand he's probably not going to, reach far over 50 if he even touches 50, but Bo Horvat's done nothing but raise his price tag since the start of the season.
He's absolutely, at least through the first quarter of the season, has absolutely crushed his contract year. And that's like full marks to him, because all the things going on with a bad team, with the contract that has really been largely ignored in negotiations with the Canucks, um, that could really impact a guy. Like, you could see someone stumble out of the gate and say, you know what, there's a lot going on here, and I can't put it aside. I'm struggling to focus and play. And he's been good. And we know that with Bo, it's not always just about scoring goals. He's a pretty complete player. Like, he provides a lot for your team in your own end of the ice that I think makes him incredibly attractive to anyone that would be interested in a center. And I can name, I don't know, 5 teams, like really without blinking, that would love to have a center. And you mentioned that you heard my hit this morning on Sportsnet Radio. Like, Columbus is one that I've had my eye on for a bit, but how about Detroit? Boston is going to need a replacement for Bergeron and Krejci. Edmonton, I believe, is looking for a center as they get closer to the deadline. Go through the teams. Like, there's who wouldn't be able to plug in a player of Bo Horvat's stature down the middle. They're hard to find, which is why his trade value is so significant. And Jim Rutherford, he hinted, like, he full on told you, like, well, we're kind of trying to sign him, blah, blah, blah. But if we don't, he's increasing his trade value. So they know it. They're milking it. I'm sure they're going to manipulate it. And in some ways, from a Canucks perspective, it might make sense to pull the trigger right now, rather than, after a 14 game stretch that follows this, where he might only score 5.
Yeah. No, it's a great point, and that's the thing. Like, his value has never been higher at this point, right? And I think getting that chance to see what he looks like on your team for an extended run instead of just 15 games in a playoff run, that maybe a team wants to see that in case they want to get him on an extension moving forward. So value's
Well,
never
the
been
other
higher,
thing,
but
Faber, I think you should consider too, is that the Canucks might be able to sweeten the pot a bit if they can allow negotiating rights before the
Mm,
trade goes down, meaning they get pretty far down the track and the Canucks say, well, if you'd like to talk to him and get a deal done, you're going to give us this in exchange. Maybe someone's willing to do that to get cost certainty on the other side of it so that the return is that much better for Vancouver. I think they'd be really wise to go down that path.
interesting. A couple guys with cost certainty that, and we'll close on this, Frank, but two guys that are more in the situation of you're just buying them for a playoff run. Luke Shen, Andrei Kuzmenko, both making under $1 million. Like if you're getting the good part of Kuzmenko, like we saw earlier in the season, instead of the last 3 games here, teams must be interested in that. Luke Shen, I mean, right shot defense market is not jam packed full of guys that are going to be available for trade right now. So I'm wondering what are the thoughts on those two players, maybe, and being someone that the Canucks want to move out here for what I expect to be a half decent draft pick return there.
Yeah, I would agree on both accounts. And I think Kuzmenko was such an unknown. Like, how does the game translate? How will he personally translate to playing in North America? Obviously, a talented guy. But as you've seen in the last few games, like, I think there's really something there and something to be said for the work that Patrick Allvin and his scouting staff did in trying to convince him to sign there. I think that was an important move. Obviously, they had higher expectations for this year. And that was also part of the risk of Kuzmenko is that if things did go off the rails, you do all this work to get him, and then he's, right after that, a UFA. It's not easy in terms of, we wanted to keep this guy, but maybe the value is more on the market than what you'd get in keeping him. And Shen, same thing. He's steady. And you look at this point in his career, like I think what's most important about Luke Shen is that he's really comfortable in his own skin. You've heard Quinn Hughes, sort of rave about how easy he makes it to play with him. He's been in a lot of tough situations and scenarios in his career. He's experienced, the upper echelon of being someone that's counted on to play big minutes and be a high draft pick, to someone that had to go back to the AHL and figure out his game, won 2 Stanley Cups, has been through a lot of different scenarios and situations that I think that experience and the steadiness factor of him, same thing, would net you something pretty decent.
Yeah, well, we're looking forward to change. That's for sure. We've been covering this team for too long and waiting for it. So sounds like that is coming down the road, which Canucks fans should hopefully be excited about. So we'll see what happens here. Frank, appreciate you joining us here on the show, and we'll do it again pretty soon. Maybe when we do have a big trade to talk about.
Yeah, maybe not all that far away. See you guys.
Chat with you tomorrow then, Frank. Thanks.